So this is the product strategy document template. You can find it on Product Pathways on the free resources. I'll also provide a link right here so you can go straight to it. But essentially the document is broken down into 3 sections. So you can think of the first section as really the state of the market, state of the business, and state of the product. That's the first section. And this is all focused on context and diagnosis, right? So we'll talk more about that in a second. The next section is really the meat of the strategy document, which, product principles help you guide towards that. But then it's really this area, which is our focuses. What are those strategic themes and those strategic priorities that we're going to actually work on and realize our vision, and what steps are we going to make and what choices are we going to make, and also our business model. And then the last section is really the appendix, right? So this is anything or a section that you can attach any additional things or additional context that you want to actually add to the strategy document. Now, it was no surprise that I actually came up with a lot of these elements before I went and read Richard Rumelt's book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. A definitely worthwhile read, a brilliant book. But in that book, it actually frames a product strategy, or a strategy, I should say, a strategy as 3 key elements. The first one being a diagnosis, the second one being a guiding policy, and the last being a coherent action. And it wasn't a surprise to me that when I started looking at how I was structuring my documents, I had elements of all 3. And this is all about the diagnosis. And obviously this has an element of guiding policy, and this starts to become our coherent action, right? And we'll walk through each of these sections in a little bit more detail. So let's start with the diagnosis in these 3 sections. So why do I get you to do this? Why do I get you to think about the state of the market, the state of the business, and the state of the product? Well, through my own learning around strategy, some key elements that make great strategies great is actually context, right? Like, how did you come to the choices that you came to? These choices shouldn't just happen. They should be informed by data and research. And what these sections do is it actually creates a forcing function to go and get that data and to do that research. So in order to fill out these sections, you need to have an understanding, a element or a level of data and insight into the state of the market and into the state of the business and into the state of your product too. And obviously, the more data rich these sections can become, the more informed your strategy is going to be, and therefore the more impactful it's going to be, right? So it creates a forcing function for discovery. The other thing it does is it actually helps create reflection. I used to do this because it used to help me. I used to find this super valuable for me to sit down and to reflect on things, right? What is happening in the market? What is the research telling me? What's the data telling me? Has anything happened around my target market or those target market segments? What are our competitors doing? Has there been seismic shifts in the market or anything like that? Have COVID-19 happened or something like that, right? What we're doing is we're starting with everything that's really external to the company, right? What's happening outside the company? And what are some of those elements that might have an impact on me and my product and what we're thinking about doing? The next section makes you start to look a bit more inwards, but still not to your product. You're still looking across the organization. And we do a same activity or a similar activity. We start to reflect on the business. What's happening in the business? Is the business growing? Is it not? Has it been profitable? What are the other products doing? What is the business strategy today? Has the business strategy changed? How does that have an impact on me and my product, right? And then finally, we get down to your own product and we start to think about, well, what's the health of the product? How is it actually performing? What are our customers doing? What are those behavioral things? What's our aspirations? Is our vision still true? Do we still have the same vision? Or does that need to be updated or changed? We start looking at things like, do we have product market fit? Are we growing? Are we shrinking? What's our unique value proposition? Do we have a moat? If we did have a moat, did we lose it? Is our unique value proposition no longer unique because competitors have saturated the market? We start to reflect on, our own product. So we start really broad. We start to work our way in. Now, I used to find this really valuable for me because this creates the context on which you're going to make the set of choices inside your strategy, that coherent action part around, right? Like, what are you going to base those decisions on? Since actually working with a lot of product managers around the world and coaching product managers and actually doing this for real with them, I've also realized that this reflection activity works really well to get them to think about things they might be missing. I've since done this workshop and I've helped companies implement strategy and helped them with this exact thing. And even when I train it too and I get them to actually do this as an exercise, it always gets their brain ticking, right? Like you can see these aha moments where they actually go through this reflection and they start to like really think about the choices that they're already making. And they start to think about their roadmap and they start to think about, their current strategy. And it really gets them to reflect on that and whether the choices that they've made are actually the right choices. And I've had moments where they've really realized, oh, we're missing something here. Now that I've done this exercise, I've realized that we're really, really missing something and we've got to fundamentally change or pivot the way that we're doing something as a result of it. And that is exactly what you want. It's exactly what you want out of strategy, right? And this is the hard part of strategy, is making those choices and basically getting the data to inform them, right? So that's the first section. The first section is all diagnosis. It's all reflection. Start with the market, start really broad and external. Look at the company external to you, and then look at yourself and your product last. Once we have that, we now need to actually start to make a bunch of choices. And this is where product principles can really come into the mix, right? So for me, product principles are actually optional. So it's up to you if you actually want to use and have product principles. But I think that they are highly valuable and very powerful. And they're not leveraged enough in the product world. I don't see enough product managers actually creating principles. So what principles are, they're essentially guiding policies that you're going to make decisions around, right? So for example, Upbank probably has a principle, which is that they are mobile first or 100% mobile at today, right? So everything that they do, they need to work within that principle and work within the constraints of it having to be mobile. So for example, they just launched home loans and they did that 100% mobile. So the way that you actually apply for a home loan is a mixture of through the mobile app and some emails, right? And once they get your contact details, they can then discuss with you offline. But this is a principle that you're going to basically make some choices around. So when you get to doing home loans, it's not about, whether we can or not can't do home loans. It's more, how do we do home loans within the principle of being 100% mobile, right? So this is very powerful because it can help you make decisions around what do you want to be versus what do you not want to be. And some of your other principles might be things like, and probably more at the company level, as I use those examples of whether you're going to do bespoke things for customers or whether you're not. And if you set these principles up front, then it makes some of your decisions later on a lot easier, right? So product principles are really powerful. I think it's worthwhile doing. It's worthwhile having a handful of product principles. Less is more generally here. So don't have 12 principles, have like 3 to 5 and make them actionable, action orientated. And what I would really do at this section is I'll actually create dot points of what the principles are. I'll give the principles like a short description, like 100% mobile or mobile first, and then I'll actually write a sentence to describe the principle. Why do I do that? Well, because principles on their own can be left up to interpretation. And sometimes we have these 1-word principles, which are terrible principles, by the way, or we have like a 2, 3, 4-word principle, a very short sentence, but it's lacking some of that context. And adding that description to the end, adding that context to the end can just remove some ambiguity and make it easier to actually interpret and create alignment around those principles. So it's worthwhile doing that. So that's how I'll do this section. So dot points, right? The next section that we get into is our focuses. So this is the meat. This is the bulk of it. This is where you're probably going to spend, well, you should spend the majority of your time. Now, this section is called focuses, but really these are what are those strategic choices you're going to make? And it's framed as strategic themes. You can think of them as strategic choice. You can think of them as strategic initiatives or strategic pillars or whatever you want to call it. Companies call it all kinds of different things. But the notion of these and each one of these is it is a strategic choice. Now, your choice is going to then break down into what is it? Why do we care about it? Who are we targeting within it? How are we going to measure success? And maybe even some more details around implementation, right? So you might actually have some choices around we're actually going to do this as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, those types of choices. Now, we don't need to get to the nth degree of describing every single implementation and design detail, but we need enough depth and detail that people can read it and really understand what that strategy is and how things ladder up together. The last section we then have before we have the appendix is the pricing and business model section. Now, originally, this section was actually contained within the strategic themes because sometimes we're going to make decisions around pricing, around our business model, and they're actually going to be strategic choices. Now, the reason why I separated this was because through my coaching and consulting and working with a lot of product managers around the world, I realized that the commercial elements inside of product strategy were often lacking and missing. We were missing out on what are those choices we're making on a pricing point of view? What's our pricing strategy? What's our business model? How are we going to sustain revenue? Are we changing our business model? Do we have a flywheel? Those types of things. A lot of those elements were lacking. A lot of the strategies that I saw were very focused more on the customer and what we're doing for the customer and how do we differentiate and have a unique value offering. And they were lacking that commercial side. So I decided to separate it inside the document to really create a forcing function to make you think about those more commercial elements. So what I want to take you through now that we walk through the product strategy document, I want to walk you through an example, and I thought I'll use the example of Tesla. Obviously, this is my interpretation of it. It's obviously not Tesla's actual strategy, but I tried as much as possible to pull elements from, actual sources and Tesla's actual sources as well from the blog and stuff like that. And from a date point of view, we're basically saying cursor 2006 when Elon Musk wrote that 3-step master plan blog post, right? So some of the things we can draw out and how we would actually fill out the strategy document if we were, following what I talked about in the Tesla example and we talk about from their blog and we think about at that point in time with the company. When we think about the state of the market, some of the things that we were looking at here were like, again, what's happening, right? Like what's happening in the world, what's happening external to the company. So some of the things I was drawing here and I tried to pull data. So this is from the actual blog there as well. But obviously climate change is a big thing. So there's an increased awareness around sustainability. So if you think about the market and people, there's people becoming more aware of sustainability. They're being more sustainable conscious of, what type of carbon impact they're having inside the world. We also have that the market is growing. It was difficult to find numbers back in 2006, but you can imagine you would actually go and get those numbers. So how much is the market growing year on year? It is growing. It's a very big space. It's continuing to grow today. Petrol vehicles are obviously a major contributor to carbon emissions. So that's something else to be considering here as well, especially if we're thinking about cars. Obviously, there's more laws coming in. So over the last, couple of decades, there's been increase in laws around carbon emissions and companies needing to be carbon neutral and countries even trying to, again, be carbon neutral as well. So those things are coming into it. We obviously have the clean energy market. So there's a sustainability market, but then there's also the market around, people who in industries that produce clean energy. That's obviously growing. So this is an important consideration when we think about batteries and we think about even things like mining, right? So the cost of some of the minerals and some of the things that we would need in order to produce the car or even anything inside this industry, that's obviously going to change and the price is going to change as supply and demand changes there as well. Currently, from a car specific point of view, there is no EV car at the moment. At least there's no mass market one. So obviously car manufacturers have built electric vehicles in the past, but they've always had very low range, those types of things. Hybrid obviously dominates the industry at this point in time. Also, other important considerations, and this is just a good example of when we think externally, we're also looking at things like, well, what's the political landscape? So I talked about the laws before, but there's also elements like there's government funding. So Elon actually talked about the government funding, and it's in some of the other posts around that about, I think even if you look at Wikipedia, that they actually ended up getting government funding around sustainability initiatives as well. So government funding was available, and that's something to consider as well. When we're thinking about having to get funding and those types of things, well, we have government funding available. So it makes, if you think about from a viability point of view around the business, these elements help build the case to say, yes, I think this is viable, and yes, we can kind of go down this path. Another thing I put here as well, which I pulled from that master plan blog article, was the fact that in order to build a more sustainable future, obviously we need to find an alternative to those ICE vehicles or internal combustion engine vehicles. And he actually had some data there as well. So you can look at like the efficiencies and those types of things, and you can show and at least build a case to say, well, yes, we do need to move away from this. And we think that we can actually do something that's going to be way better. A lot more you can put in there, but you can see the type of thinking that is going on here. Now, from a state of the business point of view, I started with the mission. I took it from the 2013 blog article, which he said was the same as a decade ago, which was to accelerate the advent of a sustainable transport by bringing compelling mass market electric vehicles to market as soon as possible. And that vision and mission statement has actually evolved, and it's become a little bit more generic these days with just accelerating the world to a sustainable future, which is what Tesla's mission statement is today. But back then, they were very focused on transportation, and very focused on that mass market. So I think this is an important element to bring into the context when you think about the state of the business. The question is like, what is the business goals? What is the business vision? What is the business strategy? Now, obviously, we don't have full insight into all those other elements, but the things that I could pull out and the things that were immediately obvious was obviously they were still small. They were a small factory, small company. They had a high R&D cost because they're dealing with new technology, which is something that Elon talked a lot about in that blog post. They raised $105 million in Series B, which I think was across 4 funding rounds, but that's $105 million in funding. They weren't profitable. Their revenue was low, but they did have a substantial amount of Series B funding. So this was about 2006, and this is where they were sitting from a business point of view. Now, from a product point of view, they were still building their first product, and the Roadster was only first coming out. So currently a prototype, not really any revenue from what we knew about. No customers or very little customers. They were looking at very high production costs, needs a lot of R&D. They didn't have the economies of scale. They're still a small factory. Obviously, building a car requires regulatory approval. He talked about the fact that new technology comes under increased scrutiny, and also the fact that being an electric vehicle cannot be its only selling point. It needs to be an EV without compromises, which kind of ties into the fact that new technology comes under scrutiny, which could be something that you could put in the stated market as well as that, but it can kind of sit in either one. I wouldn't get too caught up with where you put it on here as long as it's somewhere where you feel like it's the most appropriate. I feel like these elements are the most applicable to the product itself, and that's why I put it here. He talks about like it can't have compromises, can't be its only selling point. It needs to beat the current alternatives. It needs to be way better than its current alternatives. So if you think about this, again, we talked about how this is the diagnosis section. What we're really looking at is, well, the world is trying to become more sustainable. There's obviously funding available to it. The market is growing. Currently, there's no one really playing in this 100% EV market, not from a natural viability point of view. And we know that we need to do this from a sustainability point of view. And if we are looking into the future and want to tackle things like climate change, and from a business point of view, we're really small. We know that we got a big hill to climb. We're dealing with new technology. That means there's going to be high R&D costs. But we have got a substantial amount of funding. But that funding is not going to go too far because we do have such high R&D costs. From a product point of view, we've built a prototype. We've played with a few things. We know that we're leaning towards being able to do something. We know that that something is going to incur a high amount of cost, but we know that if we do that, we can also learn a lot more from an R&D point of view and also take those steps towards getting the next step in economies of scale. We know that if we do build a car, it requires regulatory approval. We know that if we did do something, it can't be its only selling point. It's got to be able to beat and have no compromises and beat the current alternatives out there. So that is the state of the market and the state of the business and the state of the product. And this is our diagnosis. You can see we're pulling in data here, we're pulling in elements. And what we're going to talk about when I take you through the step-by-step process of actually building a strategy, what we're trying to build here is essentially strategic narratives, a narrative around our strategy. And you can see how I kind of talked about a narrative there about sustainability is growing. It's becoming a core focus. It's something that we need to do, we must do. From a business point of view, we got funding, but we're staring at this big hill to climb. So how do we tackle all these elements? And that's when we get into the next part, when we start to have that set of coherent action that we talked about and actually making some choices. We use those narratives in this diagnosis in order to make those choices. So from the next point of view, obviously, we don't know if they had product principles back there. We don't know what those principles were, but I actually went on to Tesla's website, and Tesla has a set of principles as a company level. These are the ones that they have today. And I thought I'll pull them in just so you can see how this kind of fits. And you can see how when I talked about principles, how, you have that kind of, title, and then you have that longer description. Tesla does exactly that, which is super awesome to see. Makes it super impactful and removes that ambiguity as I talked about. But you could see how some of these elements actually came out inside their actual cars today. Like this one in particular, like make it ridiculously fun. Whilst, safety is their goal, they want the vehicle to be fun. They want it to be enjoyable. They want it to be different. They wanted to have things like gaming and movies and little Easter eggs and more. So when we think about this product principle and they actually went and built the car, it meant that they invested into these things. Like they spent time, money, and energy to build these little Easter eggs that may serve no actual functional value, but from a principle point of view, it was really important for them to do. And it was something that, defines Tesla and defines them. So again, this is how those product principles can help guide what you actually go and build. But let's get into the next section. Let's talk about the coherent action and actually come up with those themes. So now that we have a narrative and now that we have some data, we need to start to think about what our focuses are. And I just put down two here because I think there was two really key ones that we could see from back then in 2006. And obviously the first one was to build that sports car. And now, as Elon talked about, it wasn't just about building the sports car. So this is where, creating that detail in this section is so important. So whilst we may say that the strategic theme is to build a sports car, we might even call it the Tesla Roadster, we need to explain why we're doing it. What is it? Why do we believe in it? How does it support our business? What are our OKRs or how we're going to measure success, etc. You can have more things in here if you want, like who are you targeting, those types of things. But we want to start to answer these types of questions. So the details here are super important because we're not just building a sports car. It's easy, as Elon said in the blog post, it's easy to think or mistakenly think that we believe there's some type of gap in the market around sports cars. No, we're going to build a Tesla Roadster. It's going to be better than a Porsche or Ferrari. It's going to have less emissions than the leading hybrid cars today. It's probably going to be fun too. Like you could say that as well, right? But why are we doing it? Why do we believe we should? Well, we need to do it because we believe that our first product is going to be expensive no matter what. Regardless of whether they tried to build an affordable car or not, they don't have the economies of scale. They don't have the R&D yet. They don't have the size. Again, going back to all those things inside the diagnosis and that strategic narrative, we don't have those things. So we know it's going to be expensive. Therefore, why not build a really expensive car? Why not focus on the high end of the market? And you can see how these choices start to link together. And this means that we'll be able to cover the costs. In fact, we hope and we believe that we don't want to just cover the cost. We want to actually be able to make profit. We want to be able to fund the development costs and basically make a profit. And we know that we need to do this because it's not the end state. It's a necessary step towards learning, doing R&D and building towards scale and eventually that affordable electric vehicle. It supports our business strategy because we're going to basically be able to fund that R&D and be able to make those steps towards it. Now, how to stab at just one OKR, you can have others, but the question you're asking yourself here is, how do we measure success? And I think success here is not necessarily the car itself. It's actually generating enough free cash flow in order to fund, our next R&D projects. And that's kind of a key result in it. You could take the X% of R&D into a key result, but we want to basically generate key free cash flow. And we might measure that by, X amount of sales and X amount of profit, which means that we can have X amount of R&D funded, all those types of things. But ultimately, that's how we're going to measure success on this theme and this pillar. Now we'll repeat that for other themes. I didn't, outline it all here, but the second theme would be to use the profits to fund R&D, or maybe the second theme would be something around just R&D in general. Like maybe they have some focuses like let's hone in on battery technology, for example, and can we just halve the cost of battery technology? We're going to use building the Roadster in order to learn as much as possible about battery technology so we can halve the cost of it, because we know that that's one of our highest costs. And then when we move into building the next car, it should be theoretically roughly, 2/3 of the cost or less, because we know we can halve one of our biggest expenses and we can also get other economies of scale. So again, objective there being build towards economies of scale. Key results could be scale production from X amount to Y amount, lower production costs from, again, X to Y, etc. But this is what we're doing here. And what you can start to see here is we're really starting to, take these narratives and we're taking, elements, like we're taking the fact that all of this, right? Like the mass market, climate change, everything, all of this points towards, okay, well, let's build a sports car, right? Let's build a car, I should say, an electric vehicle. This type of stuff, like we know it needs to be, more sustainable future. Those types of things point to things like this, like the less emissions part. And we look at elements like, okay, we're not profitable. We've only had so much R&D. So much Series B raised. We have high R&D costs. We have a small factory. These things point to, well, maybe we do need to do a Tesla Roadster because we don't have that scale. We know that the first product's going to be expensive. We know we need to use that money to fund development costs because we don't have enough cash flow. Maybe even, when we crunch the numbers, building that Tesla Roadster might have been the only thing that they could have actually afforded with that $105 million, right? Those things also point to the fact that we need to do theme 2. We need to lower those costs. Obviously, the price point here and the profits, those things start to link back down to the fact that we have no customers, we have no revenue, we want to be able to do that. Again, EV without compromises, that links back up to the fact that we want it to be faster than a Porsche, we want it to be fun. That also links into our principle. But you can see how these narratives start to work together here. The two things go together. Diagnosis leads to coherent set of actions. Our strategic narratives in our diagnosis needs to be the thing that is informing the choices that we're making. And the two things need to link together. That's probably the key thing about this whole document, and probably the key thing about strategy in general here. So hopefully you can see how these things start to link together. I wanted to just give you this example so you can see how these things link together. And then of course, down the bottom here, we have additional sections like a business model. Obviously, we're just going to do a per unit sales to begin with, but in the future, we'd love to do other sustainable products, maybe even generate revenue from the charge network, those types of things, and then anything else you want to attach inside the appendix. So that's it. So that's an example of how the strategy document can actually look in practice. Just walk through a simple example that hopefully we can all resonate with and all understand, as opposed to something that's very unique and I have to give you all the context. So key things to take away from this is the first 3 sections is the diagnosis, and it's all about building those strategic narratives. And you can see with all these red lines that the narrative and then your focuses and your set of coherent actions need to link together. And that is the product strategy document template. As I mentioned before, this is the comprehensive product strategy document, and this is the level of depth that you should really be going into inside your product strategies. I hope you got value out of this, and if you want to learn more about product strategy, check out the product strategy course over on Product Pathways, where we go through product strategy in detail. There's a link in the description to it. I hope you find it very valuable and useful. I hope you get a lot of value out of it. And thanks for watching, and thanks for all the support. I'll see you at the next one.